Hello, y'all. This is our Unit 2 recap. So the reason why I did this Unit 2 recap on Wednesday was because we hadn't had live class in a little while, and I wanted to make sure that we had all picked up on the key information that I wanted you to get from a lot of the Unit 2 concepts that we've been talking about the past week and a half. So talking about biodiversity, and we transitioned from talking about ecosystems, this like larger scale, to talking about biodiversity into a smaller scale. And the key thing here about biodiversity is that we are not just talking about the diversity of species, but instead we've got lots of different biodiversities that we can talk about. And we also talked about how we measure them too. So with genetic diversity, kind of like the smallest scale, looking at specific genes and DNA, right? Versus species diversity, looking at different species or the ratio of the different species that are there. And then talking about habitat diversity, like the different types of ecosystems and little habitat areas that can be found in a particular area, right? And then we also talked about, specifically for species diversity, species richness versus evenness. So richness is literally counting the number of different species, versus evenness is how even is it, how balanced? What's the ratio? Are there a lot of one species and a little of another, or are they roughly even? That sort of thing, right? And then finally, in our biodiversity's basics unit, we talked about generalists and specialists. Generalists, they're looking at the root word general, right? They can live in lots of different places. Their niche is much bigger and wider. They might eat lots of different foods, that sort of thing. Versus specialists have very specific, special requirements in terms of food, shelter, water resources, that sort of thing. All right. Second major topic in this unit was ecosystem services. And we talked about different ways that ecosystems give to humans, and then I had you categorize those into different things. So here are the 4 categories that I want you all to remember: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. So provisioning are basically products, raw goods, and things that we get from ecosystems, like a lot of food. You can think about like wood and stuff like that. That would fall under provisioning services. Versus regulating services, these help regulate ecosystem processes, and we get those benefits too, right? Like flood prevention and erosion control, really important because plants help aid those things. Wetlands help with flood prevention. Certain plants help with erosion control around banks and streams, right? So even though they're kind of doing their thing, we still get the benefits from those. The third type is cultural services, which are like non-material things, like they're spiritual benefits for us, educational benefits, that sort of thing. Tourism would also fall under this. And then we have finally supporting services, which support all of these. And these are like larger scale services that are necessary for like all ecosystems to function, right? Like the biogeochemical cycles that we talked about, primary productivity. So stuff that we talked about previous unit all kind of falls into the supporting services. Cool. In terms of island biogeography, you all did a simulation online of this, and the idea here was basically you have this main land and then you have islands, and you can control the distance from the mainland and also how big and how small the islands were. So the theory of island biogeography basically says that islands that are closer to the mainland and also islands that are bigger are going to have a higher species richness, because that's easier to get to an island that's nearby. There's going to be more resources on larger islands, so organisms are not going to go as extinct as quickly, right? That sort of thing. Also, quick note, this is not just regular like actual islands like Hawaii, but we're talking about figurative islands too, like maybe because of habitat fragmentation and all of that. And then finally, the whole point of this was talking about how islands oftentimes will spark unique adaptations because their resources are so limited, or because of that particular environment is being different. Right? All right. Ecological tolerance. We talked about this in class, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but this is AKA the range of tolerance, and it's basically the environmental conditions, most of the abiotic conditions that a population can survive with. And we were really specific to talk about how this is a population as a whole and not as individual species, right? Sorry, not as individuals. And then we also looked at some graphs. We saw the difference between a wide range of tolerance versus a narrow range of tolerance and how that looks in a graph with a very wide or kind of thin graph. And then we looked at specific case studies on coral and how species ranges are actually changing because of climate change and because of their tolerance. Cool. Then we did a little bit of biology review on adaptations, and we talked about how heritable traits are that specifically help an organism like better survive the environment is an adaptation, and it has to be genetic. There are some behavioral adaptations as well that can become ingrained and instinctual, but the idea is that this works on our genes and our DNA as a result of mutations and the ability to survive. So this takes a very, very long time to be able to do. It takes many generations. It does not happen overnight like Lamarck suggested. And that these adaptations are because of changing environments. If we all had the same environment, there wouldn't be as much change. There would be some natural change because of mutations, but otherwise that's it. Cool. And then this is what you did last night. We did a Nearpod on natural disruptions, and you learned about the wide variety of natural disruptions. Easy to forget them because we live in California and we are only subject to a few specific natural disturbances and disruptions, but there are many, many that occur naturally. And you also learned that some are good and some are bad, right? We talked about how fires in general, if they're small and consistent and used kind of like how native people had used them, like long before we had colonized this place, right? That actually helps prevent these larger crazy wildfires that we're noticing right now. You also looked at some case studies on the effects of climate change and sea levels rising. And then the main thing that I want you to get out of this is talking about resistance versus resilience for ecosystems. So even though they sound very similar in words, make sure you understand the difference. You've got resistance, and if we think of the root word resist, right, it's like resisting to change, not being affected by change, or resisting the power, right? Like we don't want to be affected. So resistance in an ecosystem is like how much can they not be affected? How much can they resist some sort of disruption? Versus resilience, like if you are resilient, you're able to bounce back. It's the same thing in ecosystems. It's the ability to recover after some sort of disruption or the ability to bounce back after. So if you look at this graph here, it shows that it is not very resistant, right? Because we've had a huge dip in the biodiversity. And then the recovery rate shows kind of more of the resilience, or like how good is it able to be after the post-fire. Oh, quick note on this. We talked about how more diversity is better generally for ecosystems. So if you have a more diverse ecosystem, more diverse island, a more diverse place, they're going to be less affected by natural disruptions and disasters. They're probably going to be more resilient and able to bounce back quicker and faster and not gain as many extinctions because of the diversity. Great. And then the final thing for Unit 2 is all about succession. Succession is basically changes over time. So when we're talking about ecosystems, we're talking about how ecosystems change over time. And this happens naturally. It could also happen after a big disturbance, like we mentioned before. And it could also happen because humans are messing things up, right? So we learned about two types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary is when you start completely from scratch. It's like bare rock, you got nothing else in terms of living organisms. And then you start with some pioneer species like mosses and lichens. And then eventually you start growing the grasses, the shrubs, the smaller trees, and the bigger trees, right? So bigger and bigger things. versus secondary succession, which may be, for example, like all of the wildfires that we're experiencing. You have a disturbance or a disruption that changes the environment, but there's still some stuff there. There's still some soil. There might be a little bit of debris left, right? You're not starting completely from scratch. So this is an example of secondary succession, and you have kind of similar things over time. You have the smaller things, the grasses, the shrubs, and then you finally get more trees after the fact. And once we reach kind of this peak of number of species, we get into what's called a climax community. And that's when we have the highest species richness kind of post some sort of disturbance, so after succession. Awesome. So those were the key points that I wanted to go over. There's plenty and plenty of other details, but those were kind of the main key ideas. Make sure you add these things into your notes. Make sure you star them. Make sure you, I don't know, tattoo them on yourself. Don't actually do that. But make sure you do remember them and remember the kind of reason why each of these things is important and how it relates to the other things that we've talked about with ecosystems. Cool. Till next time.